Okay, good evening, and welcome to yet another seminar in our series in honor of the Dr. AMRIE Morris-Patterson Grief Intervention and Freedom from Trauma Foundation. Pleased to have you tuning in with us this evening, those who are with us in person and those who are online and who will subsequently view this discussion program. Welcome. My name is Anthony Patterson. I'm your moderator for this evening. And with me, as usual, we have some very competent individuals to address the topic at hand. Today, as advertised, we are looking at triumphing over trauma. Triumphing over trauma. It is, of course, a very fitting topic in light of what has happened, what has transpired since our last session, which dealt with, coincidentally you might say, which dealt with going beyond grief. So we looked at grief and related issues last time. And since then, we would have had in St. Vincent and the Grenadines, where we are based, the passage of Hurricane Beryl and the devastation that that hurricane would have caused. I refer to it as Beryl the Beast, ravaged St. Vincent and the Grenadines, particularly the Grenadine Islands, and then in particular Union Island for St. Vincent, and also for Grenada, Carriacou, island of Carriacou. A lot of damage across the state, and so we decided that it was fitting to bring this topic forward. It was slated for later down in the year, but we decided to bring this topic forward because it's quite relevant to the times. And in light of Hurricane Beryl, you know, a lot of persons would have suffered significant losses and are currently, you know, experiencing significant trauma as a result. And, you know, I would have listened personally to some of the experiences of individuals who would have lost their homes, lost their businesses, lost their boats in some instances, lost loved ones, and who are still, you know, wrestling with all that emotional difficulties that come with that. And so I want to welcome us, and we're going to be hearing from our panelists with regard to, you know, the causes and effects of trauma and how, you know, how we deal with this. How we deal with these various types of trauma. We were looking at not just natural disasters, but you're talking about various other kinds of trauma and their effects. So with us this evening, we have, let me begin first with Mrs. Jennifer Marshall. Mrs. Marshall is very well known in St. Vincent and the Grenadines. Those who tune into the radio will know her voice quite well, and she has taught many, many students, so quite familiar to many. She's a counselor and a retired teacher, so we have taken her out of retirement a little bit this evening. She has worked with children and parents in various settings, such as the school and the community. She's also involved in ministry at the Elim Community Church in Queens Drive. She has worked alongside her husband in coordinating the Let's Face It radio program aired on the NBC radio on Tuesdays. This program has dealt with various social, emotional, and psychological issues, including coping with trauma. And Ms. Marshall is, you know, I would say a spiritual counselor as well. I mean, her program, Let's Face It, I've listened to many, many times. Called in a couple times, and it's a very rich program, very, very beneficial to many, many persons. I think programs like hers, you know, you really won't see the full impact of these programs or tell the full impact maybe until you get to heaven, as I say. But, you know, really happy to have her, that she has consented to be here with us this evening. And we have returning with us Dr. Karen Providence, medical practitioner, mental health practitioner, many years service with the Ministry of Health at the Mental Health Center. So she's quite experienced with these kinds of issues. She has been with us before, and we're happy to have her once again. And the thorn among the roses this evening is the pastor, my good friend, and also the pastor of the South Windward, I have that right, South Windward District of SDA churches here in St. Vincent, and Pastor, prophetic, Pastor Dane Nichols, the father of two children, a boy and a girl, and the husband of one wife. A man of much experience. I often say, and I think it's pretty much appreciated, that pastors are counselors in their own right. You know, they do some counseling courses as well, but just by virtue of being a pastor, you know, you have to deal with a lot of these issues. And we also want to hear, you know, from a theological point of view, how we address this issue of trauma, various types of trauma, and we'll get into that. So I'm going to ask the panelists to give us a couple opening statements before we get into the questions that we have to address this evening. Just a little opening remarks, their own opening remarks as we begin. Whoever wants to go first.
Well, thanks for having me. Thanks for having me. And as you heard, we are looking at the topic, triumphing over trauma. Some persons will tell you that it's a very difficult process. So the word triumphing, it's an interesting one because it is saying you can have victory over something that is so devastating. So as we go through the afternoon's proceedings, we are hoping and trusting that what we share with you is something that you will find very beneficial, that will be on the same wavelength, so to speak, and that will be able to see that regardless of the situation, regardless of how painful an incident is, while there are certain things in place and so on, then we are able to gain strength and we are able to move on from there. So that's what I want to say now.
Good evening, everyone. Thanks again, Mr. Patterson, for your invitation. Hello to my well-known co-panelists, Mrs. Marshall, we go way back, and Pastor Nichols. So it is a pleasure, I would say that, in spite of the unpleasant circumstances that would have given rise to choosing this topic, etc. It is a pleasure to be here with these esteemed colleagues and to see if we can maybe make a difference in how people are perceiving what we are going through. We know it's the beginning of the hurricane season. We have, I think, over the years become a bit comfortable in our tiny country and islands, that we are not usually bothered by the kind of situations that Beryl would have brought to us. And so I think it's new territory for a lot of people in St. Vincent and the Grenadines and perhaps other places like Carriacou. So yes, people might not even be aware that they have been traumatized by their experiences. The storm, though, certainly would not be the only reason why people in St. Vincent and the Grenadines are experiencing bad emotions that could be characterized as trauma. So I would try today with my fellow panelists to see if we can look at that and some of the other factors that might be impacting people emotionally, and together to see how we can perhaps find solutions. To adopt a phrase from Mrs. Marshall's radio program. Okay, thank you.
Yes, let's face it.
Okay, well, good afternoon, everybody. Well, I'm happy to be here. I'm thankful for the opportunity to sit beside these two learned young ladies. I'm happy to be here. Well, I'm here to lend my voice and give a spiritual perspective. Of course, the Bible has much to say about trauma, and there are traumatic experiences faced by various persons in the Bible. And perhaps this evening we can look at, while answering the questions presented to us this evening, I'll try to give a little biblical perspective. And maybe we can even look at a little case study. As I answer the question, I'll try to incorporate, biblical narratives, particularly from the book of Job, which can give us, much insight into how we deal with trauma from a spiritual perspective. There are many studies, I believe, that show that spirituality and faith helps tremendously in dealing with these things. So I'm here to do that, and I hope that at the end of it, we will be better equipped, all of us, to grapple and deal with this thing we call trauma, especially in this time of disaster.
Right, thank you very much for those introductory remarks. I was listening to a brief interview with a lady who had lost her home in the Grenadines, and the interviewer was asking her, she has two teenage daughters, and the interviewer was asking her if she's coming to the mainland. There was a ferry that was, taking persons from Union Island, from the Grenadines to St. Vincent. And she said, she had lost her, she was self-employed, and she had these two girls. And she was basically saying she was confused. She didn't know what she was going to do. The interviewer asked her if she was coming to the mainland, if she had family in the mainland. She said, yes, she has family in the mainland, but she's not sure about the accommodation, And she basically just said she don't know what she's going to do next. And, her facial expression, her voice just said this was somebody who was really, really in a state of, a traumatized state, I would say. She had experienced this loss. She wasn't, in terms of an income now, there was uncertainty. Security for her girls was one of her concerns as well, understandably. All right, so in terms of whether she was moving, she wasn't sure if she was leaving, as you would say, out of the frying pan into the fire. So she wasn't sure if she should move or she should stay. And, it just stuck in my mind when I heard that. This was a couple of weeks ago, but right after the hurricane. And it just says to us that persons have been affected by this storm in ways. Sometimes some persons express it, as we'll come to, and some may not be so expressive, but a lot of persons are dealing with this. So, the first question I guess I would want to throw to the panelists is, apart from things like disasters, which is forefront in the minds of everyone, now we're talking about the relief efforts and rebuilding and so on, but what are some of the other causes of trauma, more commonly?
Okay, so interestingly, in mental health, psychology, and Mrs. Marshall would speak more about this, trauma could be characterized as what is called simple trauma and complex trauma. And interestingly, the simple trauma would be the big things, like burial, like the sudden loss of someone who isn't ill, so you weren't prepared for losing that person. Loss of property, being a victim of crime, of violence, etc. I think we have come to acknowledge trauma, or trauma moved into the realm of mental health when they started to look at post-traumatic stress in people who went to wars. But it was soon discovered that many other people are traumatized and would have similar experiences who have never even left their village or their town. So the big traumas, the sudden things that are extremely distressing, that is what is referred to as simple trauma, while complex trauma is considered to be the little things that occur on a regular basis, perhaps in the home, in the school, on the playground, bullying, etc. And so certainly now with Beryl, what we are looking at would be the big trauma, the things that would lead to conditions like acute stress disorder and PTSD. Like the case you referenced with this lady who has lost, in one instant, lost her home, lost her ability, her employment, so her ability to provide for herself and her daughters, would be facing severe insecurity. That's acute trauma. Those are big things. But the things that she seemed to be afraid of or concerned about are the small things that are going to perhaps traumatize her children, subjected to violence, perhaps interruption in their education, etc. So those are some of the things, but I'm sure my fellow panelists would have other things to add.
Yeah, others to add, right. But just one thing though, when you use the term simple, because I don't want to, you want to maybe qualify that a bit. When you say simple, people might take that to mean it's not such a big deal.
Right.
Then.
So that's not the case at all. But what it is, it's usually an identifiable one-time event. You see? So when someone asks, where were you when, for someone who say lives in New York, as an example, and they say, where were you when 911 happened? And if that person was you're asking the wife of maybe a firefighter or a police officer, they would have a clear idea of where they were, depending on did their husband survive, did he come home, etc. You see, so it's a clear event. Where were you during burial? Hiding in my bathroom, okay, something like that. So it's a one-off event, and it is encoded in what is called our episodic memory. We are not usually going to forget that event and the impact of that event. While for complex trauma, it is insidious. It happens, it is slow, but it's pervasive. It continues.
Over a more extended period
Over an extended period of time,
okay.
Usually beginning in childhood when human beings are most vulnerable. I don't want to do all the talking, so I'm going to pass the back.
No, but it's good to explain that because, persons might misunderstand the terms,
Yes.
Yeah, so I just wanted to clarify that for persons. All right, yeah, so let's take some of the examples of trauma, yeah.
Before I go into the example, some of the examples, I want to quote from the American Psychological Association, and that's a professional organization that represents psychologists in the USA. And their definition of trauma is an emotional response to a terrible event like an accident, rape, or natural disaster. So I think that's where you're talking about the simple trauma. The response could be one of fear, it could be one of anxiety, it could be one of panic, it could be one of shock. So all of these go together, may go together. You may find them acting on the same person, and the experience is one that could be debilitating. It could weaken both the immune system and the resistance of the individual. When I thought of the topic, what came to my mind were some headlines. So what I did was to go to the newspapers, and I looked at some headlines. So some of them are what I took from the headlines. Hurricane wreaked havoc as it swept through, and I didn't bother to put the names because I didn't want to add anything more than what the persons are feeling. Man shot and killed in broad daylight. Dormitory blaze leaves 19 dead. Gunman opens fire on a school. At least 20 are believed dead. President, and I left out the name of the president, orders invasion of an unnamed country. And I'm sure that some of us are thinking of Russia and Ukraine, but actually this headline was from 1961. So what this does is to show you that throughout the ages, we have always had trauma and traumatic incidents. We have heard about natural disasters, and I think those of us who live in the Caribbean are very familiar with natural disasters, whether they're floods as a result of the hurricanes, or whether they're just flash floods. You know, it doesn't mean that you have to have a hurricane for the gullies to overflow and for people to be washed away. It might not be a lot, but over the years we have had traumatic experiences like those. And sadly, when we bring to mind like the experience we had on Christmas Eve, 2013, some of us would remember that painfully as they reflect. So those are some of the traumatic incidents that we have, events that could cause trauma. Of course, there could be serious accidents, and we too are familiar with many accidents, and this could be accidents of all types, motor vehicular accidents, accidents on the job. I recall a young man explaining to me what happened to his arm. He was working in this factory, and somebody accidentally turned on the power while his hand was in the equipment, and he had to stay there for hours while they tried to get his arm out and for his arm to be at least intact to some degree, because it was going to be crushed. And when his mom came in and found, mom was a nurse, and saw him, she almost fainted. This is just to tell you that trauma is very prevalent, and it's going to leave a mark on individuals. So apart from the serious accidents, you might have life-threatening illnesses. And just imagine someone there watching a parent dying. It could be fast, but on the other hand, it could be slow, and it could be painful. And just the agony of seeing that could be very traumatizing for all concerned. So I'm going to pause here.
Okay. Well, much was said there, and those are excellent examples of trauma. Maybe I just want to add that trauma could be. It's a deep personal experience, right? And people process trauma in different ways. But the interesting thing is, what might be traumatic for one person might not be so traumatic for another person. You know, I guess we'll get into, you know, our coping mechanisms and all of that, I'm sure, because we're dealing with victory over trauma. But I just want to add that, you know, that element, that it's deeply personal. And having visited Union Island right after the hurricane, you know, you get a sense of the trauma caused, and people, you know, they were very quick to relate their experiences. They wanted you to know what they went through. And you listen to some of those experiences, and you wonder how are they going to pick up the pieces? You know, how are they going to start? Where do you start? Where do you begin? And so it's deeply personal, and people deal with it in different ways. What I want to add, though, is, you know, very often when we think about trauma, you know, Dr. Providence mentioned simple trauma, complex trauma. When we think about trauma, most of the time, we think about the simple trauma. We think about the events, the catastrophic events. But we don't think so much about child abuse, right? We know it's traumatic, but that's not what comes to our mind immediately when we think about trauma. We think about accidents. We think about, you know, these sort of things as mentioned by Ms. Marshall. But, you know, think about child abuse, domestic violence. These are traumatic experiences that people live through every day, you know. It happens repeatedly, and, you know, people have to deal with that. So all this, you know, we have to consider in exploring the topic.
And this is related to what tying back to what Dr. Providence talked about, that prolonged exposure to, you know, certain types of adverse circumstances, various types of abuse, you know, and we could list the various types of abuse that persons experience, and especially as it relates to children, because, you know, we know that, you know, those seeds or those effects that felt from childhood can linger with you and haunt you, so to speak, for want of a better word, throughout your life, you know. So that's so important. I was actually thinking, because we're using the hurricane reference, you know, we have to force ourselves to think. I'm glad Ms. Marshall gave those examples. Pre-burial, you know, what were some of the things that were, you would say, were the larger or the main traumatic issues? I remember attending a disaster management conference, and a gentleman was giving his experience of a previous hurricane. Now, this hurricane was like many, many years ago, and this man literally cried in the audience. Big man cried in the audience because he was like having a flashback as to what he experienced in that event. And, you know, it says that these things can linger with you, and you have triggers, things that could cause you to, you know, relive these experiences. And I was also flashing back to a number of, you know, instances in the local context of rape, you know, child sexual abuse cases. And, you know, there are a number of things that do not make it to the news. As I said, the majority of cases or instances of abuse and you know, traumatic occurrences really do not make it to the news. And it occurred to me, you know, that as I thought about this some time ago, that a lot of people are walking around with plenty burdens, you know, that, you know, and then when you see certain things come to the surface, or when you see they act in certain ways, it's been there, but just that maybe, as somebody said, the straw that broke the camel back, then they act out. You know, so there are a number of causes, but just a quick, I'm gonna pick on Dr. Providence here. I saw something that said, or cited a presentation. It cited mental mental, is it mental disorder as a cause of trauma. I don't know how you'd explain that.
Well, I would think having a mental disorder could be the cause of trauma. We stick a comma there. But often what is acknowledged is that there's a close association between people developing mental disorders and prior trauma. A lot of them, including substance use disorders. So there's a clear association. So who would having a mental disorder be traumatic for? One, the affected person. If we know that a lot of symptoms of mental disorders are played out by the affected people in the public domain. And often, people are not very sympathetic and definitely not empathetic. And so the kind of attention someone who is exhibiting symptoms of their mental health condition in the public would get is often negative. And it's not often the kind of attention that they need. Because if you consider that the person's ability to make proper decisions is one of the main domains that would be affected when they have a mental health condition. And so what they need is somebody who can recognize that this person might be acting this way because they are unwell, and they need to be taken to a place where they can have the help that they need. But we know there are limitations everywhere, in every country. And sometimes that doesn't go well. There's a stigma if that person is treated and wants to re-enter society in regaining their job, even sometimes getting back accepted to their home. But secondly, to their children. Imagine a mother, especially because in the Caribbean, we know that families, a lot of our families are single parent families headed by women. And imagine a mother who has a mental health condition and has young children. If that person has to be taken in for treatment, who cares for her children? Who protects the children from all of those little issues that Pastor Nichols mentioned and I alluded to, that we characterize as complex traumatizing issues, right? So definitely mental illness would be, having a mental illness would be something that predisposes an individual to
So
trauma.
it could be both cause and
Exactly.
effect, right? Thanks for that. So let's look a little bit closer at some of the effects of trauma. We would have cited a few based on the examples that were given there. But prior to Beryl, I think the crime situation in the country is, and not just in St. Vincent. It's a regional, you might say, global issue. All right, we are not at war, although sometimes you kind of have to wonder. We are not literally at war. We're not in Ukraine. We're not in a country that has declared war or been declared on us. But we are suffering, it seems to me, some in little ways, maybe not so little for the people who are directly affected. Loss of, young men in particular, all right? Marshall cited an example there of, most recently, a young man who was gunned down right here in Kingstown, in Marquis Hill. And interestingly enough, there was a video that was circulating. I just happened to see it because somebody insisted that they must show me. And apparently, the mother of the girlfriend was shot as well, and apparently the child would have witnessed this incident. All right, so right away, it brought to mind something I had observed or thought about before, in that when we hear the statistics of another person gunned down, another young man or woman killed or raped, or the implication, what are the implications for the families of these individuals? Some person might say, well, as a friend of mine, I was relating, I cited something on Facebook, and the person said, well, it's just these people killing off themselves. Basically saying this is not a big deal. Just a small group of people, taking out each other because of drugs or, whatever. So that's not that's among them, right? Why do people have this kind of, is that, how do you respond to that? Because it's almost like you're denying the impact that this thing is having beyond just, in addition to the person being killed, you're denying that this thing can have an impact beyond that.
Okay, let me try to give an initial response, and I'm sure I'll be helped by my fellow panelists. But, what I realize is that we have become very desensitized in our society. We have become so accustomed to seeing these things that we can become detached, emotionally detached, not realizing that there are real people involved. People are hurting. We don't see it that way sometimes, because I said before, trauma is a deeply personal experience. And if we don't have that personal attachment or connection, we can certainly not even begin to empathize, sympathize, nor definitely empathize with people who are affected. So, on some level, I think we are facing that type of a reality, that type of detachment and insensitivity. It could be, what we're exposed to on a daily basis, and there might be many explanations for this, which we could offer. But I think that's primarily, in my opinion, why we are seeing this sort of a thing, right? It's a detachment from, the humanness of facing that type of a trauma. It doesn't really move us as perhaps it used to.
I totally agree with what you've said, because what we find that's happening is because persons see these images almost everywhere. You view them on television, you watch them in videos and so on, and after a while, you don't even realize that these are real people and they feel real pain until it hits you. And you might find too that even though you may have relatives who are engaged, after time you might even become detached too, because that emotional part of you has stopped responding to love and compassion and care and all of that. So it's a combination of things, and one cannot help but mention the music. I'm told that when some persons go out to do acts of revenge or whatever it is, they put on these heavy metal music, which deadens their senses so that they can commit those acts without feeling badly.
Yeah, and, well, I've heard similar, not just heavy metal, certain types of dancehall music that people pump in their vehicles to hype up themselves. I say almost to numb themselves to what they're going to do. But you had something.
Right. So I, having worked in mental health for over 20 years, I happen to see a slightly different perspectives. Regarding the public response or lack of response, that's not related to work. That's just my observations as a citizen where I've wondered whether people are now adopting denial as their coping mechanism, where if because of certain situations, if we can think that these bad things are happening to them, not us, we are the good people and these bad things are not going to happen to us because we are good, but bad things are happening to them because they are bad. And so it creates an artificial sense of security. Denial is sometimes necessary for our very survival. Okay? So this is not a critique of anyone or any society or any village or whatever, because I'm part of our society in St. Vincent, in the Caribbean, in the world. But yes, it could be, and perhaps in time, this might be explored. But the other aspect, though, is that there are people out there who are really hurting, but who do not find appropriate outlets for their hurt. And if time would permit, I'll give two examples. The first one, I smiled because it happened in kind of an unexpected and I thought humorous kind of way. But I was at a place today, I came directly from there to here. And as I was getting ready to leave, a young person came in and said, "Oh, I'm ready for you to diagnose me with PTSD. Not making it up. So I'm thinking, does this person know that I have like something to go and talk about trauma? So I looked out and I said with humor, you know, you would be a very easy patient because you already came in with your diagnosis. Usually it's not like that. Even somebody who has flu would say, "Doctor, I have fever, I have whatever," and say it might be flu, you see? But so we had a little encounter. He was actually engaging with someone else, one of the workers there. But and I said, "Well, why do you think you have that?" And he went on to share life experiences. And it so happened that one of the incidents he shared was something I was familiar with, where a young man was recently in this year, a few months ago, was murdered. I happened to be familiar with one member of that young man's family. And I was here when the young man was murdered. I traveled during the funeral, but then when I came back, I reached out to the relative who I knew. Actually, someone else had asked me to get in touch with this person to ask them to do a certain favor for them. So it was Sunday, and I remember taking my phone, messaging that person by WhatsApp saying, "Hey, sorry that I'm bothering you on Sunday, you know, but such and such is asking if you can come in tomorrow," which was the Monday. And so when I saw my phone ringing, maybe at around 5:30 or minutes to 6, the Sunday afternoon, and that person was calling, I just assumed that they were calling in response to the message that I had left. I wasn't prepared for what I heard. The person, when I picked up, I heard screeching, distress, terror. And that lady was saying to me, Miss Ravi, they killed the other one. They killed the other one." It made no sense. I said, "What? What are you saying?" And she was on the phone, distressed. I said, "Is there anyone else there I can talk to?" She said, "No, everybody here, we all here, you know," and that kind of thing. So I gave some instructions because she was telling me that someone there where she was even more distressed than she was. And so I said, "I think this person needs to get to the hospital," the person she was identifying. It turned out that the brother of the young man who was killed months ago was shot and killed on that day. And I said to the lady, I said, "Okay, I will get back to you." I did call her back. But when the first young man was killed, she had asked me if I can have, because I work in mental health, can I come by and talk to the family and stuff? But I was traveling, like I said, I traveled before the funeral. I tried to make arrangement for someone else to go. So when I came back, I asked, how was the family doing, etc. And they were pulling through from that first incident. And then when this second brother was killed, I'm like, I have to go. But I pondered about it for a while. What can I say? I myself, I didn't know these two young men. I don't know what the circumstances were. But for me, it was like, wow.
That's a lot to handle.
So what I did reach out to a fellow pastor of the Seventh-day Adventist Church, Pastor Franklin. Thank you for accepting. Well, I spoke to someone and I said, I cannot do this. I do not know, I do not have the words to speak to this family, to console them during this time. I said I would go, but Pastor, can you go with me? And he accepted, and we visited the home. So I know that people are hurting. People are leaving St. Vincent. Their survival plan is to leave St. Vincent with their children. So this is not a joke. It is not a joke.
Yes, quite so. As I said before, thanks for those sentiments, because the ramifications of traumatic incidents go in so many directions. Like we showed that rock in the puddle and the ripple effects, they go so far. And it's so important. I heard a psychologist speaking in the context of the USA recently, and he would have served in the military, and he also advised the Congress in the US, because he was also a senator or a congressman with regard to mental health policy in the States. Dealt with soldiers with PTSD and all of that. And he gave a statistic, and my mind just, was boggling. He said there's a shortage in the US of, I don't know how they come by this number, of 30,000 psychiatrists or psychologists. 30,000 shortage. And that's the United States. I don't know what it is for St. Vincent, but you get the sense like the current. And from talking with a counselor yesterday in St. Vincent too, who is working at one of the shelters here in St. Vincent, you get the sense like he's like doing the job of two people, in terms of trying to deal with persons at the shelters, and he has another group to deal with. So, he's a school counselor, so he's doing this work, but he has to be here and there, and it says then. We seem to have some shortage, or significant shortage of counselors to deal with the increasing, kinds of trauma. There's a species of trauma that we're faced with, and what's the solution there? From mental health, how do we address this? We're not going to train counselors in a hurry, right? At least qualified counselors in a hurry. And it says then maybe we need more community support, or, what other, since we're not going to get that many professional counselors right away, what are the other ways that we can deal with this?
Well, I think that part of the answer is what we're doing now. Because that awareness is crucial. It might be denial, as Dr. Providence suggested, that some persons prefer, or it might not be prefer, it might just be that they're in denial. But when they are faced with the statistics, when they're faced with the real life experiences, then that's where the denial will stop, because you are seeing the objective evidence. So I think part of it is to preach the message of compassion. And it cannot be simply word of mouth saying that we love you, going to church, and just hugging your brethren. We have to look to see the ones who are falling in the cracks, between the cracks. And I say this because I've said that I work in a church setting, and you are familiar with kids in church. You would know those who have needs, and you would want to make a difference in their lives. And just think of all our churches, if we genuinely, and I'm not even going outside the church, not that I don't want to, but I'm just beginning there. If we cared enough, because we have to start from there, from seeing the little ones, knowing that they don't have the meals that they need for them to function in school. So you want to pay attention to that. You want to be sensitized to what they are going through. So you listen to them and not just ignore them because they look unkempt, you know. So this is what we are saying, that it begins with compassion. It begins with being sensitive to the needs of those around you whom your life touches, or with whom you come in contact and you have the ability to influence. Okay. I think that is crucial.
Thanks for that. I know, I don't know all the psychological theories and so on, or treatments, I should say. What are some of the basics in terms of dealing with trauma, helping persons to process what they experience? I get to understand that, how you deal with something a traumatic event. There are a number of factors that play into that. Maybe we want to touch on that a little bit. And what are some of the basic ways that whether you're a paraprofessional or non-professional like me, as it relates to, how do you advise persons in terms of treating traumatic events or helping persons to deal with these events in their lives?
To hear Pastor Nichols on this, because like I said, sometimes what people need at the very beginning, yes, security, absolutely, even before water, people need to feel that they are secure when they're going through difficult times, but spirituality, offering them hope, is definitely down there on number one on that list. So I will defer now.
No, definitely. The spiritual component is very, very, very important. And very often the first person people would call is the pastor. They don't call the healthcare professional first. They call for their pastor once they're in a church. And from my experience, even if they are not a church goer, they still call for the pastor. I've had experiences where people in the community where I serve, once they go through something, they call for the pastor because they need, first and foremost, reassurance that it's going to be all right. They need to feel a sense of hope, that there is hope in spite of what they are going through. And that is what the Bible offers. That's what spirituality and faith offers. It offers that element of hope beyond what is immediately in front of them. And that's what we have to provide, you know. I promised at the beginning a little case study, and when I look at the book of Job, what Job went through, very traumatic, lost his, all his possessions, he lost all his children in one day, he lost his health. And you see, who you have around you is important. I don't want to sound like a preaching a sermon now, right? But the friends that Job had around him, you know, made his life miserable because they were saying, look, it's because of you. You're the victim,
Did something wrong.
But there's something wrong with you. You have done something wrong to offend God. Mm-hmm. And you know, one of the questions that Christianity and any religion has to answer is why. And one of the most difficult questions is, why do bad things happen to good people? Why do I have to suffer like this? And, you know, you have to answer that from the point of view of the gospel, you know. Christianity is the only religion that offers a plausible answer in that what God decided to do is not to stop trauma, but to enter into it. Okay? God decided to be a part of suffering, to give up everything he had,
Right.
to lose in order for us to gain. And the hope at the end of that is that this life never promises us a utopia, but there is hope beyond this life. And without that hope, I have found, it is impossible to deal with a grieving mother who have lost their child. It's impossible to console a wife who have just lost her husband in a car accident. You know, it's impossible to reconcile a good God allowing something so bad to happen. And offering that hope is, in my opinion, and these days as a pastor, there's almost every week you have to do a funeral. Practically every Sunday there's a funeral that I have to conduct. And of course, before the funeral, you have to deal with the family. And, you know, offering that hope, for me, is the most important thing that we have to address. How is their hope? How do I get out of this? The only way is to offer them the hope, the hope that is beyond this, right? Yeah. And that's my perspective on it. I don't know if I've touched on concern what you're really asking me, but that is how, you know, I'm trained to deal with it. And that is the only thing, to me, that makes sense to people, that there is hope beyond what they're going through right now.
Right, as is often said, you know, while there's life, there's hope. If you don't believe that, then there's just despair. I mean, persons who are trying to rebuild their lives, coming out of, you know, whether it's a disaster or some kind of, you know, personal abuse or physical abuse, sexual abuse, or crime, being a victim of a crime, you know, you have to have a belief that things are going to get better somehow, if not immediately, gradually. Otherwise, you just, you know, give up in despair. You know, there's been no reason to carry on. And people, depression and, you know, anxiety and all these kinds of things come. Persons feel suicidal and so on, if they don't have that sense of hope. So that's really critical. It sounds fundamental. It sounds, you know, might sound simplistic to some people, but hope is key. I recall there's a young man in our community, and, you know, every time I encounter him, I get the sense of somebody who has given up. He literally says to me, you know, there's no hope for me. I'm trying to encourage him, you know, to commit his life to Christ and so on. And he will say, he would have lost his mother and lost his sister. And I think somewhere in the aftermath of that, you know, he would have been so wrecked emotionally, spiritually, that he's at a point where, and he has given up. He's drinks a lot, and I guess, and that's another effect. People try to soothe their sorrows, with alcohol and other drugs and so on, and he has given up on himself. I encourage him to, but that's the kind of person that needs maybe more. There's that spiritual side, but sometimes I think he needs maybe some actual, professional help, right? Maybe a balance of both to help him to really get back, get his life together. And there are a lot of young men like that around. And, not just young men, young people, generally speaking, that need that kind of help. So I guess the challenge for us, part of the challenge for us as counselors, pastors, lay persons who have this concern, how do we pull this together? How do we direct persons to have that sense of purpose, to find that spiritual, that base? Because you're seeing a lot of young people, as in particular concern for youths, who are not having that grounding, and we have discussed this before in previous programs, not getting that spiritual foundation. How do we help them to gain that before a crisis comes and they have to deal, and they find themselves potentially without the tools to deal with the trauma?
I'm still processing the question that you asked, but there's something that I want to pick up on from what Pastor Nichols said. And he spoke about the importance of encouraging the young person. And I would want to say part of the encouragement comes from how you handle the individual while they go through the trauma. Because if a person is experiencing trauma, you have to be prepared to listen to them. You have to be prepared to wait on them until they have reached the point where they feel free enough to speak. And one of the things that you learn is that each person has a story. And for you to be able to help them, you need to hear their story. But this is not something you can go and beat over their neck and say, tell me your story. It has to be brought out gradually. They have to own it. It brings it out. And when they feel free enough to tell you, how you relate to them during that time is important. Because they're not going to be talking to somebody that they do not trust. They're not going to talk to somebody that they don't think care about them. So this is where, and I always go back to the compassion and the humanness comes in, because who you are says a lot, and persons will respond to who you are, not simply the things that you are saying, but what you do and how you do it. So tell me the last question.
All right, so equipping persons with the tools to process traumatic events. How do we help persons to have that toolkit?
Well, again, you start by listening to them. You start by helping them to understand that what they have gone through, yes, is traumatic. What they have gone through is something that could affect anybody. So they realize that it is not simply, and it might not be anything that they did that caused it. And that's important for them to understand, because some persons have false guilt. Yes, some may have good guilt, but some have false guilt. And so, for example, you may have lost a child, or that child may have lost a parent. That child might begin to think, oh, it is because of me. It's because of the little things that I used to do why mommy died or daddy died or whoever it is died. The mom might begin to think the same thing. So you have to help them to process that. You have to help them to own up to their humanity. And I say help them. They have to come to that themselves, but you can guide them. You can show them that these things could happen to anyone. And it doesn't necessarily have to do with their behavior. It is just a part of the brokenness of this world, the brokenness of society. Things happen, as Brother Pastor Nichols said, things happen to good people. And we're not saying that we're all good people. No, but things happen to people.
To people
Yes,
in general.
people. Yes.
I want to touch quickly because our time is going, but I really want to get this in. And this is going to lead on Dr. Providence here. Somebody comes to you having experienced a traumatic event, and they need something. Say, okay, Pastor Nichols refers someone to you, all right? Because he has done what he thinks he can do as a pastor, but the person he feels needs some further help, therapy, as we would say. There is this technique that they call CBT. How does that help with trauma?
So that ties in a lot to what Mrs. Marshall was just saying. Because CBT, which stands for Cognitive Behavioral Therapy, and the part, it sounds kind of fancy and big, but all it means, when we speak about cognition, we are speaking about the things that our mind is responsible for. And in that snippet is the thoughts, the kind of thoughts people are having, how those thoughts would give rise to beliefs, and how those beliefs might lead to certain behaviors, okay? And so when the first thing really is to listen to that person. Listen to what they're saying. Mrs. Marshall mentioned the false guilt, feelings of shame. Okay, someone who's been traumatized but think that they were somehow responsible for their trauma. They are going to feel ashamed. A child who's in a family where the parents got divorced and they are the one who daddy move out or mommy move out or something like that. And they're thinking, maybe if I were a better person, maybe if I did my homework, maybe if I washed the dishes, daddy would not have left or mommy would not have left. So grows up into an adult who continues to have similar beliefs, okay? They want to do everything right. If they fail, that's a person who's at risk for maybe substance use, not trusting people, not forming close relationships because they think that they're a bad person, and so they don't want anybody to get to know them because they don't think they deserve to be known. So it's listening to the person's thoughts and listening to those recurring thoughts that might be negative, that I wish I could have, I should not have, I can't, and those kind of negative thinking, generalization. So this person, didn't pass an exam and needs to repeat a grade or something like that, or needs to do a resit, and then the thought is that I'm not good at anything, Yeah, my teacher in grade 1 had told me I wasn't a good student, I wasn't good for anything, and now they're in university and that thought is replaying, okay? So it's listening to those thoughts, helping the person, and like Mrs. Marshall said, guiding them, because it's not telling them. Maybe saying, do you think that you have a pattern of thinking that might not be helpful? What an example of such thoughts that you have. And how are you using those thoughts to make decisions about your life? So helping that person, sometimes journaling is something that most times we recommend. So write things down. Even you might want to write the negatives one part, the recurring thoughts that are giving rise to anxiety, but also write the positives. What are the things, so you're afraid if you get to school late, that the teacher might put you outside. But what about the days you get to school early? You see? How did that day go? How do the interactions at the workplace, not every one of them would be negative. So tracking that, tracking your thoughts, tracking your beliefs, and therefore trying to correct that process. You see, sometimes it's rethinking the thoughts. So if I can't do anything right, it might be simply restating that. I can do many things right.
Yes. Yeah.
And believing that. And applauding yourself when you do things right, okay? So cognitive behavioral therapy, it sounds complicated because of the name, but it's a helpful thing for people to be aware of. Just listen to what you're thinking, and if those thoughts are not helpful, rethink them.
Thank you very much. And I want to throw this to Pastor Nichols now, because we're almost at the end. And is CBT something that we can ground in any sort of biblical basis? How do you make that connection for people?
Definitely. The Bible says, whatsoever things are good, just, think on these things. Think on these things. You see, our thoughts drive us. And the Bible helps us to rewire our thoughts. Okay? And, you see, one of the problems I have is Christians often try to offer very quick fixes to issues that don't work. Pray about it. No, prayer is powerful and important. I'm not saying prayer doesn't work. But sometimes we don't want to take the time to listen and to help the person to be rehabilitated. We offer just quick fixes. Pray, read the Bible more, right? But we need to point them in the direction of where their mind is and help them to escape from the prison of their minds. In my church, the Adventist church, we often quote, we often say that the mind is a battlefield. Battles are fought and won in the mind. And the enemy attacks us through our mind. That's where he gains a foothold, first and foremost, and leads us down a spiral of sin, of degradation. So it starts there. Depression, all these things starts in the mind. And this type of therapy helps us. Mindfulness, all these things. Mindfulness, I'm not talking about the Eastern philosophies
of empty your mind,
emptying your mind.
Meditation approach.
Instead, fill your mind with positivity. Whatever things are good and just and lovely, of good report. If there be any virtue, if there be any praise, think on these things. Yes. Fill your minds with things that will replace those negative thoughts. Find things to do that will bring you satisfaction, and replace them with. And it's so very important to have things in your life that you can turn to. These days, for a couple of years now, I'm turning to the ocean, right? I go to the beach. Marshall is very familiar with that. She goes there very often, right? I see her sometimes on Sunday morning, and she sees me. She reminded me. No, you don't go Sunday, right? But you see me from time to time there. So I go in the middle of the ocean, and I spend some time out there. I just float around, enjoy myself, look up at the birds, right? Yeah. I swim. When I get tired of swimming, I float. I spend some time out there, and I just try to connect and disconnect at the same time. So all this is part of of this type of therapy. You are rewiring your mind to think a certain way and get out of certain habits of thought. You know, so it's very important, even in the spiritual realm, and the Bible is filled with it. You know, our case study, Job. Job had to focus his mind on the positive things, okay, to get out of that state of where his friends were leading him. Even his wife, his wife said, Job, you must be crazy. Why don't you curse God and die? You know, Job said, woman, you have to be a crazy woman. You know, I can't curse my God. So, you know, even the way we relate to God in all of this is important. We have to see God as not being a part of the problem, but a part of the solution. So our faith and spirituality comes in very importantly here, you know, if we are a person of faith and spirituality, you know.
Yes, you just actually touched on the final question that we have to deal with. You know, how do you advise persons or counsel persons whose traumatic experiences make them lose faith in God? I think you touched on it quite well there, because you know, if you're Joseph and you have been thrown in the pit or sold into slavery, you may be inclined, based on your mindset or your spirituality, sense of purpose, spiritual purpose, you might be inclined to think, well, you know, God has forsaken me, or you know, what has become of the dreams that I had, or what will become of those dreams, you know. So anything further you would say on, you know, how do we avoid our trauma causing us to lose faith in God?
Oh, well, you know, I want to say that it could make you or break you, right? Yeah. Trauma could make you or break you spiritually. It all has to do with your response, you know. So I would say, you know, I would point us back to Job, and I would point you back to something I said before. We have to see God as part of the solution, not as part of the problem. We have to understand that human suffering is a consequence of, you know, our past as human beings, or our former mistakes, and we can't avoid that. But, you know, the way God dealt with it is that God has entered into human suffering, and he has promised us something better in the future. So we can't see God as part of the problem. We have to see him as part of the solution to our problems. And that is not always easy. I would be quick to admit that, because when you're going through something, you know, sometimes the last thing you want to hear is anything about God, right? So sometimes, even as a pastor, I don't put God as the first thing I say. Sometimes I just have to say nothing. I just have to be there, all right? And just be in the person's presence and not try to force God on them. You know, they're going to have to come to a point now where, you know, we can communicate, and they might be in a place where they want to listen now. And I offer whatever help I could offer. You know, so don't force God on them. Don't force God as the solution. Even though he is, you don't try to push them until they are ready, because then they will reject rather than accept. And that's my experience in the past, you know.
You know, honestly, as you said, that I was relating to a young lady at my church recently. I won't call her name. She lost a good friend, and she came to church, and she was visibly upset, you know, and she expressed it. She said she was, you know, why is this, why God allowed this to happen? And all I could say at the time, I just said, pray. You know, I didn't want to, you know, sermonize and, you know, this kind of thing. I just said to her, because I could sense, and I've, you know, been where she was, and I could, I didn't want to just give her, you know, scriptures, and as much as I could probably find scriptures, but I just said pray, because sometimes it takes some time for persons to really, humanly speaking, deal with what they're going through, and have that grief, you know, come out, release, so to speak, before they can, you know, while they're wrestling with God and asking the why questions and trying to make sense of what is happening, You know, worship was hard for her that day, honestly, having lost this friend. You know, so, challenge, yes.
Swallow some, whatever. Oh, okay, so the person was gone through trauma, was undergone trauma, would most likely be sad. Of course, it could last for some weeks and months, but sometimes it goes further than that. But one of the things that counselors are encouraged to do, and not just counselors, but people generally, is to seek out ways that they can engage individuals. So recently, a group of individuals went to one of the shelters. And one of the things that I saw them do, I was pleasantly surprised. They had games, and they engaged the persons, mainly children who were there in games. So there was cricket and other games. And what that did was to take them out of focusing on poor me and I don't have this, have that. At least that for that half an hour or for the time that they were there. Again, if we are the light of the world, we shine the light and we look at where the needs are and we try to meet the needs. As the brother has said, you don't try to trust God on them, but whatever you do, and even the way you model grief and your own pain, those of us who have undergone loss, that is a testimony, and that is meant to show them. You might not set out to do it, but that is showing them that God does not mean for our loss to keep us sad and depressed, but there are ways that he can help you. And ultimately, really, this is for you to grow, and certain things could happen. I've known of people who have gotten closer to God as a result of their loss. Yes, I've known of people who have walked away too, but there are persons who have gotten closer to him. So it depends on your worldview and how you see God. And of course you want to, at this point, endeavor to be in that place where you can say, God, I don't understand. I don't understand, but you show me what you are doing in my life or what you want to do.
Okay, so quickly, I think the final point that I would like to make is the importance of empathy. And especially if we are speaking about mass events, like the impact of a natural disaster, where, in our local St. Vincent context, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, we know the tiny, fragile islands of the Grenadines, that the people there and the infrastructure was more affected than us. And so we on mainland St. Vincent might not have gone through, obviously, the same thing, but it should not be difficult for us to understand what a mother is feeling when she doesn't have a job, no home, all the clothes are wet because they lost the house, lost the roof, the school roof is gone, the church roof is gone. So, but we have our church, we have our home, we have our dry clothes, and washing machine to wash them in. But there shouldn't be a barrier in us understanding what the people are going through, even if we are not going through that. That's something as human beings that life experience should teach us. And that is really important. And I know that a lot of churches have been reaching out and to offer assistance, and that is important too. That is extremely important because, yes, it's important to reinforce that the presence of God means if you believe that God is there, then whatever you're going through, as difficult as it might be, you know that you're not going through it alone.
Yeah.
You know, it makes it so much easier. Imagine when all of us, well, many of us, the part we experience together, for the majority, is not having electricity. But if you're in your dark house by yourself, but you, instead of being by yourself, there's somebody there with you. And
yeah.
just know that trauma could be the dark place and God being there with you. But yes, people need support, and we all have our roles to play, whether it's having little discussions like this, or I know this building is involved in, you know, assisting with the registration and that kind of thing. Organizing and mobilizing help for people. Security is extremely important, right? People might be reluctant to leave an unsafe place if they think that the little things that they have left, say the windows in their house, the roof gone, but the windows okay, and they think, I might leave and somebody takes the windows. And so security is important. So yes, we acknowledge the need for the spiritual, the reinforcement, the acknowledgement that believing in God gives you hope and, you know, faith that things are going to get better.
Right.
But the people need to know that there are other people who are going to look out for them and help them through the challenging times.
Yes, I give that practical support. You know, thanks so much for that. That sense of hope and community and empathy, collective empathy, is so important in dealing with trauma. One of the things I would just add in closing is we talked about CBT, and that's sort of a personal thing between a counselor, maybe a group therapy as well, in some cases, right? So there's that counselor or personal relationship between a counselor and a counselee, and then there's that community aspect of it as well. And I would just say in closing that there also, the counselor is also trying to get that person to have hope that there is, you know, still a purpose for their life. And this book here that I have here, I just bought this as an exhibit. Kind of, it's called Your Life After Trauma. It's by Michelle Rosenthal. And she herself was a victim of a traumatic experience for 25 years. And, you know, she went through a long process of recovery and healing, and this book is a product of that. And I just brought it here to say, or to show and make the point that, you know, a lot of books, works of art, other things that people do with their lives have actually come out of, been birthed out of traumatic experiences that they have had. It's not that, you know, you have to go through trauma to have these things, you know, happen or be produced, but it is at least, you might say, as the scripture says, all things work together for good, or out of a bad situation, good can come, right? So I think that is so important as a product of the hope that we're trying to instill, that persons see that their lives still have purpose, there's still a divine plan for them, and if they believe in that and have faith, in the midst of their trauma, they can triumph. They can, you know, overcome the obstacles and still make much of their lives. So I really want to thank those who have viewed this evening's discussion. I trust that something would have been said that would be of immense benefit and be transformative for you. Thanks for your continued support, and we'll look forward to our next session, where we'll look at another interesting topic in the line of mental health and spirituality. So God bless you, and take care of each other until. All the best. Thanks to our panelists once again for enriching our discussion this evening. I'm sorry?